It was late October, and I had been hiking for hours in the hopes of arriving at a campsite before dark. I had miscalculated how long the trail would take, and by the time I realized I wouldn't make it, I was already too far into the woods. The wind had gotten chilly and sharp, and the daylight was rapidly fading. I didn't intend to stop at the cabin. I was miles away from any road, and the only place to stay was the little dilapidated cottage off the path. I almost didn't go inside since it seemed like the beginning of disaster. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges, the roof sagged in the center, and one of the windows was broken. I stared at it for a moment, considering my alternatives. The cabin appeared better than nothing since at least it had walls, but remaining outside didn't seem secure because the wind sliced right through my jacket and I began to shiver. If I remained outside, I'd spend the night outdoors, and I wasn't sure my body could handle that. I woke up at early dawn and continued to move, telling myself it was just for one night. My boots crunched on the warped wooden planks as I went out onto the porch. As I pushed the door open, it creaked loudly in the silence. There was a single room empty save for a rusted metal cot pushed against one wall. The mattress was long gone, leaving only a bare spring-covered frame. The floor was covered in leaves and broken glass. The air smelled stale like damp wood and old dirt, and the only light came from the last of the daylight leaking through the cracked window. I placed my pack in the corner and tried to ignore the strange feeling I had about the place. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but I think it might have been the silence. Normally, the woods were alive with sounds like birds, insects, and the rustle of leaves, but here it was so quiet that even the wind outside seemed muffled. I told myself that I was imagining things because I was tired, cold, and hungry, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I unrolled my sleeping bag and spread it out on the floor as far away from the cot as I could get. I didn't like the way it was sitting there in the corner, seemingly waiting for someone, and as the light faded, the cabin grew darker and darker until I could hardly see anything. By way of I ate a quick meal from my pack and then settled into my sleeping bag, using my flashlight sparingly. I reasoned that if I could just get some sleep, morning would arrive sooner, but I lay there for what seemed like hours, staring up at the dark ceiling and listening to the silence. Every little sound made me jump. Outside my mind, the rustling of leaves was going crazy, filling the darkness with forms and shadows as the wind pushed against the hot walls. The next thing I remember is waking up to a faint, rhythmic thump sound. I lay motionless, holding my breath, trying to figure out what it was. I thought it was just an animal, possibly a deer or a raccoon, coming from outside near the back of the cabin, but then the sound changed, becoming steady and deliberate like someone was knocking. I sat up, my heart pounding, and the thumping stopped for a moment, making me think I might have imagined it, but then it began again. Louder this time, as if someone or something outside wanted me to hear it. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the back wall, and the beam illuminated the cabin's interior, but the noise stopped again, and I remained motionless. The silence dragged on, and I began to consider going outside to check, but something in my gut told me not to. Minutes later, I heard heavy, slow footsteps crunching on the leaves outside the cabin. They moved slowly, pausing every few steps, and I felt my chest tighten and my breathing become shallow. I remained as silent as possible, holding the flashlight like a weapon, and the footsteps stopped at the front door. My mind raced as I waited for the door to open, but nothing happened. The silence dragged on, and then, Just when I thought they had left, I heard a low, raspy breathing. It was close, just on the other side of the door. I wasn't sure if I could take whoever was out there, but just staying put felt just as risky. My heart was pounding in my chest as I considered my options when the door creaked and only partially opened, revealing a shadowy figure. I could only make out the outline of a tall, broad-shouldered man who was standing there breathing. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. Instead, I grabbed my pack and ran out the back window, ignoring the glass that scratched my hands and knees as I scurried through, hitting the ground while bouncing wildly in the dark with my flashlight. I ran until my lungs burned and all I could hear were my own footsteps. When I finally stopped, I was far from the cabin in the woods, collapsing against a tree to catch my breath. I didn't see him again, but I also didn't go back for my sleeping bag. I hiked through the night with my flashlight sparingly, my ears straining for any sound, and when the sun finally rose, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't until I arrived at a ranger station later that morning that I realized how fortunate I had been. The rangers informed me that the cabin wasn't on any maps, it wasn't in the park, and no one knew who had built it or why it was there, but they had discovered evidence in the form of old clothing and abandoned equipment that suggested I wasn't the first hiker to encounter the man in the cabin. They never caught him, and I never went hiking alone again. In 2012, at the age of 27, I accepted a night shift security job in the middle of nowhere in Queensland, Australia. The company I worked for had contracts with remote properties, and this one was especially remote, a cabin used by a mining company to store equipment and documents. It was located miles from the closest town, and the job was to stay overnight, keep an eye on the cabin, and report any unusual activity. The drive there was uneventful, but as the dirt road continued into the wilderness, I started to feel the weight of the isolation. The cabin itself was a simple one-story wooden structure with a tin roof, surrounded by a small clearing. The bush appeared impenetrable, with tall gum trees and dense undergrowth. The cabin was surrounded by a chain-link fence, and there were floodlights installed at each corner, but they only illuminated the immediate area. I parked my vehicle close to the entrance and went outside. The air was humid and heavy, and I could hear cicadas as I made my way to the cabin. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots in the stillness, and as I reached the cabin, it had a little mildew odor. A desk with a chair, a small kitchenette, a cot in the corner, and a row of filing cabinets along one wall. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead. I checked the security cameras, 4 of them covering the perimeter. Everything seemed quiet. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made a pot of instant coffee and settled into the chair, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The signal was weak, but it was enough to keep me distracted. Outside, the floodlights cast long shadows on the ground. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness beyond them was pressing closer. Around midnight, I decided to stretch my legs. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the night had changed. The cicadas were quieter, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I walked the perimeter, shining the beam of my flashlight along the fence line. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Back inside, I locked the door and returned to the monitors. The front gate, the back fence, the cabin side, and the clearing were all captured on video. It was my first time working alone in such a remote location, so I told myself it was just nerves. However, at around 2 in the morning, something caught my attention on the monitor. The feed from the rear camera flickered briefly before going black, so I leaned forward to see if it would return. I checked the other cameras, and they were still operational. The logical part of me assumed it might just be a technical issue, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach, so I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to check the camera. As I approached the back fence, the beam of light seemed to diminish against the darkness. When I arrived at the camera, I noticed that it had been torn from its mount, the wires hanging like exposed nerves, making my skin prickle. The damage appeared to be intentional and not something an animal could have caused. I looked around with my flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness. The bush behind the cabin was dense, with the trees creating tangled shadows. The bush remained motionless, but I felt more watched than ever, and my heart was racing as I turned and rushed back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I sat at the desk and stared at the monitors. The remaining cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was out there. An hour went by, and I forced myself to remain vigilant, drinking stale coffee and checking the screens every few seconds. Just when I thought I might be having hallucinations, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone gently knocking on the wall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping continued steady and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the back door, my hands shaking. The sound stopped as I approached. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping outside. The air was cold now, and the bush seemed unnaturally quiet. I shone the flashlight along the back wall, but there was nothing there. No one. As I turned to go back inside, the beam of light caught something on the ground. It was a footprint, pressed into the soft dirt near the wall. It was fresh, and it wasn't mine. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Who could be out here miles from anywhere in the middle of the night? I locked the door and checked the cameras again. This time I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint movement at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the floodlights. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stared at the monitor, willing the figure to step into the light, but it stayed just out of reach. The next few hours were a blur of tension. The figure never came closer, but it also never left. It stayed at the edge of the clearing, a dark silhouette against the trees. The tapping started again, this time on the side of the cabin, then the front. It was as if whoever or whatever it was testing me, trying to gauge my reaction. By dawn, the activity stopped. The cameras showed an empty clearing, and the tapping had ceased. When the relief crew arrived, I was too shaken to explain what had happened. I simply packed my things and left, driving away as fast as I could. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I heard rumors about people disappearing in the area, their belongings found abandoned, but no trace of them. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but the memory of those footsteps, those knocks, still haunts me. Every time I hear a tap at night, I can't help but wonder if it's starting all over again. When I was 28 years old in 2013, my brother Ryan, a 32-year-old police officer who was known for being among the best in the department, called me out of the blue and asked if I could help him with something important. He told me to pack enough clothes for a few days, sturdy boots, and anything I might need for roughing it in the woods. Ryan was the complete opposite of his job as a graphic designer, and I always admired his courage, even though I thought he could be a little too rigid at times. Knowing Ryan, I didn't ask too many questions, but he promised to explain everything once we met. He wouldn't give me any specifics over the phone. The next morning, I took a car to Brookhaven, a little community tucked away in Washington State's foothills. As we drove for more than an hour on winding dirt roads, the trees grew denser, the air grew colder, and the sky grew darker as thick clouds rolled in. Eventually, Ryan stopped his truck in front of a small, weathered cabin that looked like it had not been used in years. The location was remote, with no self-service and no neighbors, just miles of forest in every direction. Ryan met me at a gas station on the outskirts of town, but he was not in uniform, which was unusual for him, but he still had the same serious expression on his face. Ryan said that after he unpacked his belongings, I saw he had brought a large duffel bag, a gun, and what seemed to be military gear. That's when I realized this was no ordinary camping trip. At last, Ryan clarified our purpose for being here. He had been investigating a drug trafficking ring in the area, and the suspects had been hiding their supplies in isolated cabins like this one to evade detection. His team had raided multiple locations, but one important player, a man named Derek Mills, a violent fugitive with a history of eluding law enforcement, had gotten away. When I asked Ryan why he needed me, he explained that he couldn't send any other officers because the department didn't have the resources to send backup for such a remote location. He needed someone he could trust to watch his back, which didn't exactly calm me down, but I didn't want to let him down. We settled into the cabin, which was as rough as it looked. Inside, there were bare bones, a couple of old CS, a rusted stove, and a dusty table. There was no electricity, and the only source of light was an oil lantern. The air was moist and chilly, and Ryan had dragged in a mildew odor. Ryan put up his equipment, which included a police radio and surveillance equipment. He also demonstrated how to use binoculars and a basic first aid kit in case I wasn't sure what I had committed to, but I trusted Ryan. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling of leaves. The first night was uneventful, and we took turns keeping watch, with one of us sitting by the window while the other tried to sleep. By the second day, I was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. While Ryan was outside checking the perimeter that afternoon, I heard a strange noise, faint footsteps that were almost imperceptible, coming from the woods behind the cabin. My heart raced, so I grabbed the binoculars and looked through the window. Ryan's seriousness didn't help either. He rarely spoke and his eyes were always scanning the tree line. He told me Mills was dangerous and had a history of ambushing officers who underestimated him. I didn't see anything at first, but then I saw a figure darting between the trees. When Ryan came back inside, I told him what I had seen, and he checked his rifle right away. He told me to stay inside while he went out to investigate. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me not to. He was gone for almost an hour, and when he finally came back, he said he hadn't found anyone, but he had seen fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin that night. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the wind howled through the trees, making it even more difficult to concentrate. At midnight, I heard those faint footsteps again, and this time they were closer. I nudged Ryan awake, and he grabbed his rifle, and we both stared out the window scanning the darkness. Ryan motioned for me to keep low as he crept toward the door. He opened it just enough to peek outside but didn't step out after a few tense moments. There was a loud bang on the side of the cabin, followed by silence. My heart was thumping so hard that I thought it might burst. He then closed the door and whispered that nothing was there. The following day, we discovered deep scratches on the wooden walls of the cabin, as though someone or something had been scratching at them. Ryan dismissed the marks as being caused by an animal, but I wasn't sure if they were intentional or dangerous. By the fourth day, we were both tense because the food we had brought was running low and I was beginning to feel lonely. But Ryan seemed even more determined. He thought Mills was close by, waiting for the ideal opportunity to attack. That night, as the sun went down and the woodland fell into darkness, the tension grew intolerable. In an attempt to surprise Mills, Ryan placed a tripwire attached to a flare around the cabin's perimeter around 3 in the morning. After the flare went off and the cabin erupted into red light, Ryan snatched up his gun and walked out the window, gesturing for me to remain still. When I heard a gunshot and saw him approaching slowly with his flashlight piercing the darkness, my stomach fell, and I hurried to the window in a panic to find out what was going on. Ryan ran back toward the cabin and yelled for me to lock the door. He then burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. His face was pale, and his breathing was ragged. He told me that Mills had been armed and that he had managed to wound him, but that Mills had fled into the woods for the rest of the night. Ryan decided it was too dangerous to stay, so he radioed for backup, but the signal was weak, and told me to pack up our belongings while he kept watch. As we were loading the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: Mills' footprints leading directly up to the back door of the cabin. He had been watching us, possibly even listening to us, and now he was out there, wounded but still dangerous as we drove away. The forest seemed to enclose us, the shadows lengthening with every mile, and I couldn't get rid of the thought that Mills was still out there, observing and anticipating his every move. On the journey back, Ryan didn't say much, but his quiet said a lot. This wasn't over, not for him, not for me. As I lay in bed at home that night, unable to sleep, I realized that Mills was still out there and that Ryan would not stop until he was apprehended. Every rustle of the wind outside and every creak in the house made my heart race. I came to the realization that the true fear wasn't just in the forest, but that someone like Mills could be out there waiting for the right opportunity to strike.